Well, good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue reading The Bishop Who Ate His Boots with Chapter 6, Part B. Deputation work, however, could not afford a permanent answer, and the Stringers hoped it would soon be possible to return to a more settled form of work. The answer to their hopes came in August of 1903 in a letter from Bishop Bompas of Selkirk, inviting them to take up work at Christ Church, Whitehorse, in the Yukon Territory. The bishop was aware of the circumstances which prevented the Stringers from returning to the Arctic, but he felt that Whitehorse was sufficiently convenient should immediately medical care become necessary. He was also willing to take the financial risk of bringing in a missionary who might find it necessary to leave at short notice, or even with no notice at all. Stringer wrote at once to Bishop Reeve, saying that although he did not wish to leave the Diocese of Mackenzie River, he thought that the appointment at Whitehorse might well provide a temporary solution to his predicament. Bishop Reeve gave a rather reluctant consent, and on September 11th Stringer wrote to Bishop Bompas intimating his acceptance and saying that he and his family would expect to arrive in Whitehorse towards the end of October. By the end of September they were on their way west once more, and when they arrived in Winnipeg, Stringer attended the sessions of the Diocesan Synod, when Samuel Pritchard Matheson, Dean of Rupert's Land, was elected suffragan bishop, an election which was to be the cause of some difficulty later on. The day after arriving in Vancouver, they boarded the Princess May, bound for Ketchikan and Skagway. Rather to their surprise, there were only 2 other passengers on board. The voyage was a reasonably comfortable one. As usual at that time of year, the weather was damp and foggy, and the crossing of the Queen Charlotte Sound quite rough. They woke on the morning of October 29th to find themselves at the dock in Skagway, the steamer having arrived about midnight. After breakfast they went ashore to make the last-minute arrangements for the next stage of their journey. They saw their luggage taken from the ship to the railway station, called briefly to see the priest in charge of the Episcopal Church in Skagway, and boarded the train soon after 9 o'clock. The White Pass and Yukon route, a narrow-gauge line from Skagway, Alaska to Whitehorse, Yukon, had only been completed 3 years earlier. Like all travelers, the Stringers were impressed by the steep climb of 2,900 feet in 30 miles, and by the deep valleys and precipitous rocks. They stopped for a midday meal at Bennett, and were happy when the train rolled into the station on the bank of the fast-flowing Yukon River at Whitehorse. At the railway station they were met by Christopher Reed, who had been taking the services at Whitehorse pending their arrival. He quickly escorted them the few yards from the station to the rectory. A few days later Bishop Bompas himself appeared to add his welcome. He stayed with them overnight at the rectory and returned next morning by train to his home at Carcross. The Stringers were greatly impressed by the relative comfort and accessibility of their new post after the hardship and isolation of Fort McPherson and Herschel Island. The rectory was a commodious log house built in 1901 by the first incumbent of Whitehorse, the Reverend R.J. Bowen. After looking over the house, Stringer noted, quote, "Our house is very comfortable, or will be when we get it fixed up. Electric light in both church and rectory is very convenient," unquote. Whitehorse at this time was a town of 2,000 people, with 20 retail stores, 6 hotels, several restaurants, 2 newspapers, and mounted police barracks with accommodation for 200 men. Reed remained at Whitehorse for almost a month, and it was not until the end of November that Stringer attempted the Sunday services unassisted. When he did so, he was glad to note that at the end of the first Sunday by himself, both throat and eyes had stood the test well. This was a happy omen for the future. He was back in the north, and back at work. The next few weeks were occupied in settling down in the rectory and getting to know the people of the parish. Then, on Sunday, December 20th, 1903, just before the morning service, the Stringers' third child, Alexander John, was born. Mrs. Stringer was impressed and grateful for the presence of doctor and hospital. These were circumstances very different from those in which the other children had been born. The excited father evidently felt unable to preach a sermon that morning, and read one appropriately entitled, quote, "Rejoicing in Religion," unquote. On the text, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice." For the next 2 years, the Stringers lived happily in Whitehorse, and for perhaps the only time in his life, Isaac was engaged in what may be described as an ordinary parochial ministry. He visited regularly at hospitals, conducted his services, and took a full part in the parochial and community life. On February 20th, 1905, he received a telegram from his brother James, telling him of the death of his father on the 17th. He was being buried on the day the telegram arrived. Once again, the distance added to Stringer's sorrow, and made him feel more keenly the thousands of miles which separated him from the rest of his family. He recorded this event in his diary, quote, "Although I have been expecting this sad news for quite some time, still it is a great shock to realize that the relationship of an earthly father is severed for all time," unquote. Before they left Whitehorse, the Stringers acted as hosts to the first diocesan meeting of the Women's Auxiliary. The WA had been formed in Ontario in the late 19th century, and branches were being formed throughout the Dominion. The first meeting of the Selkirk Diocesan Organization took place at Whitehorse on Thursday, September 7th, 1905. The president was Mrs. W.C. Bompas, who was not able to be present, and her address was read by the rector of Whitehorse. All but 2 of the 11 members present were from Whitehorse. The other 2 came from Carcross and Dawson. Among matters discussed were plans for the establishment of branches in other parishes and missions in the diocese. A resolution was also passed approving a fund for a boys' industrial school at Carcross. A few months later, Isaac Stringer, now 40 years old, was elected Bishop of Selkirk in succession to William Carpenter Bompas, who after 40 years of missionary labor had resigned the see. So Stringer's brief incumbency at Whitehorse came to an end, and on Saturday, November 25th, 1905, he, his wife, and their 3 children left Whitehorse to begin another chapter in an already eventful life. And that's the end of Chapter 6. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 7. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.